This is a lecture from Open Tuition.
This video is one of three that looks at the approach to the September-December 2020 Advanced Performance Management exam. And this particular video looks at question 1, the 50-mark question. With all questions, what we recommend is that you go first of all to the requirements to be alerted as to what the question is kind of about, the requirements that you are expected to address. And in this one, we have at the end of the question, first of all, write a report. So as soon as we see report, we know we ought to put that in a report format: to, from, date, about. A little introduction, not much more than 1 or 2 lines. The introduction doesn't contain anything of any worth, but it really looks better. Reports of introductions. And we have to respond to instructions for work in the following areas. And when you read the question, you will see that embedded in the question there are more detailed instructions that we need to refer back to from this requirements section. So, the critical success factors and key performance indicators for Deal and Police. So here we have a police force, Deal and Police. So it's a not-for-profit organisation. And as soon as you see something dealing with a not-for-profit organisation, immediately in your mind there should be certain warnings or potential difficulties maybe which should be registering with you. First of all, with not-for-profit organisations, there are often many more stakeholder groups. In a profit-seeking organisation, you tend to work primarily for the shareholders, and your metric is really to maximise profit or share value. With a not-for-profit organisation, there are very many disparate stakeholders who all have potential valid stakes in what the police force is doing, so that can be more complex. And secondly, in not-for-profit organisations, if you don't have profit, of course many of your performance indicators in a profit-seeking organisation relate to profit, relate to financial performance, and we don't have all of those there. In not-for-profit you have all the costs on one side, they're easy enough to address. But then what's coming in on the other side? Why are we expending these costs? It's not to get revenue, it's not to get profit. It's to get some sort of, generally speaking, some sort of service. And of course to define what that service is, or the various aspects of it, and then to actually measure that is immediately more difficult. So that should be there even before we get very far. And then it says here, so the critical success factors and key performance indicators of Deal and Police. So critical success factors, the things we really ought to get right, and key performance indicators, how you are measuring the extent to which we are addressing properly those critical success factors. 16 marks, that's the longest part of the question. An evaluation of value for money services provided, and again we're dealing with a not-for-profit organisation. As soon as you see something to do with value for money, I would think the 3 E's is about the only thing you've got going for you: the effectiveness, the efficiency and the economy. The use of non-financial performance indicators, well, I've hinted at that already. Many of the performance indicators in a not-for-profit organisation will be non-financial, and they may even start out being non-quantified, and we have to work hard to quantify them. Then finally, the use of league tables in measuring performance of Deal and Police. Now that's an interesting one. When we come to look at part 4, we'll see that really this is very like a question that came up, I think, in 2013. And then, of course, there's the normal professional marks for format, style, structure of the discussion of your answer. So back to part 1, critical success factors and key performance indicators, and this refers us back, we will have read the question by now, and we'll see that this refers us back to something which is in the question. And basically what they've had before for the critical success factors, or key areas for action as they call them, the four at the top: protecting and supporting those at risk of harm, ensuring criminals are caught and brought before the courts, achieving long-term sustainable solutions to the causes of crime, and addressing new forms of crime arising in the virtual world. In other words, cybercrime. Now, essentially, what has happened here is that I think an advisor has been brought in, and the ministers indicated that she felt the four key areas were too vague, and in order to better focus actions, the minister's advisor has suggested that these four old critical success factors, or areas where action is required, are reformulated into the bottom four here: greater protection and more support for those at risk of harm, be better at catching criminals, reducing the causes of crime by increased involvement with local communities, and to create a task force to deal with the cybercrime. So here, again, more to do with the requirements here. You have to provide justification in the light of the minister's concerns for the changes the advisor has suggested. In other words, from the first four to the second four. So we need their justifications, really. And then he wants you to provide justified recommendations for up to 2 key performance indicators per CSF to measure performance. And there is some data given in Appendix 1, which is down here, the bottom of the question, which may be useful in some of the calculations there of the key performance indicators in at least some of these cases. It does say here that you're allowed to suggest new data, which would be helpful, and the CEO has made it clear at this stage no calculations are required. And that's quite important, because it's easy when you see figures to often get your calculator out and do something which is kind of almost a distraction to you, almost comforting to you to begin to do some calculations. But it's just suggesting maybe how you could use some of those figures. So first of all, the justification here didn't see why the 4 original areas weren't adequate and the new formulations are better. We have to justify why that is. And I must say, when I read this first, it took me a little while to see that there's very much difference in it. Obviously, we have to find a difference, and significant differences, because that's what the question wants you to do. But I think it can take just a little bit of work before you realise how the second set of 4 could be better than the first set of 4. So let's look at the first one: protecting and supporting those at risk of harm, and greater protection and more support for those at risk of harm. And the difference really is that the second version requires you to come out with some sort of measurements, to define some sort of measurements, and eventually to calculate some sort of performance. I mean, the first version, protecting and supporting those at risk of harm, it's all very fine in a kind of airy-fairy sort of way, but there's nothing in there to suggest how well you should protect them, how well you should support them, and nothing in there to tell you whether or not you're actually achieving those. Whereas when you go down to the second one, greater protection, greater, better, more, all of these words imply that you can compare old performance to new performance, and if you can do that, then you're essentially forced to really crystallize, define, and then measure key performance indicators. The second one ensuring criminals are caught and brought before the courts, going to be better at catching criminals. So the first one, ensuring. What does that mean? Does it mean 80%, 70%, 90%, 100%? And at least two says be better at catching criminals. We could, at the back of our mind, say, well, let's look at the case clear-up rate. How many crimes have solved? For how many crimes have people actually found guilty, and some sort of retribution is meted out to them. Third, achieving long-term sustainable solutions to the causes of crime. That is one of the vaguest ones. What on earth does that mean, achieving long-term sustainable solutions to the causes of crime? Does it mean you should shoot criminals? That would probably not politically acceptable, but that would solve crime. Maybe the causes of crime and criminals. No, it's too airy-fairy again, but the second version here, reducing the causes of crime by increased involvement of local communities, gives you something to hang on to. It still leaves open for us what's meant by increased involvement of local communities, and I think that's something we have to address later in the question. But again, there's reducing. So there's a comparison going on here, a comparison going on here that we can track over the various years. And fourth, create a task force to develop skills in detection and prosecution of crime. So again, addressing new forms of crime. What's that mean? Producing some sort of report on it? No. Now we have something which is very much more specific, very much more useful. Create a task force. And we will know at the end of the period whether we've done that or not. We will have some sort of budget, I would have thought, for the number of people to be on this task force. And again, this was something will come out in probably the second part of the question. It says here up to 2 key performance indicators to measure performance. So greater protection and more support. There are 2 things in there. So greater protection and more support of those at risk of harm. Greater protection could be simply the number of police personnel. So walking up and down the streets, driving around in their cars and the motorbikes or something. If you simply increase the number of kind of pairs of feet on the ground, that is a way of providing greater protection, and that's fine. You may think of something else. More support for those at risk of crime. What does that mean? Well, it could be going round to people and advising them, sending leaflets out to advise them on, linking to 4 here, about phishing scams and these sort of things. It could be advising people on new locks to put on. It could be after a crime has been committed, as well as trying to solve it, you send around some sort of liaison officer to ensure that that person hasn't been, too frightened by the crime which has taken place. Be better at catching criminals. Well, that would be a pretty easy one to measure. I could look at simply the number of cases which have been cleared up. It could be maybe to do with the absolute crime level. If the absolute crime level fell, then we're presumably better at catching criminals, and somewhere along the line probably better at deterring them, get him to move on to the next area. Reducing the causes of crime by increased involvement of local communities. That's quite a tricky one. I'd probably just go for maybe 1 KPI there. So increased involvement of the local community. We could, for example, organize courses. So we could organize courses, let's say, to take, shall we say, I don't want to stereotype here, but let's say youngish people who may be being attracted into crime for the first time. I'm talking about kind of, the slightly dangerous teenage years here. And if we were able to perhaps organise some sort of youth clubs, sporting events, something of that sort, go around schools and talk to schools about the effect that a crime has both on the victim and your future job prospects and so on. That could be increased involvement with local communities. And again, once we set that up, we need to measure it. So it could be the number of school visits undertaken, for example. It could be, maybe if somebody has committed a small crime, you don't take them to court, but you get them to come to a kind of an educational course for 4 weeks. It could be the number of courses or people which you attract to that. Again, that's involving the local community to try to nip the problem in the bud. Create a task force to develop skills in detection and prosecution of virtual crime. Well, obviously you could measure the number of detectives who are assigned to this specialty. You could simply look at the budget which is used. You could look if you're developing skills in detection, then it implies maybe people need specialist trainings. You can keep an eye on the number of people who've undergone this specialist training, pass an exam of some sort here. And we could look here in the detection and prosecution of virtual crime. We could also keep track of the number of cyber crimes which you've managed to bring to court and to prosecute those criminals. So once you get into it, it's not too bad. But I do think initially seeing the difference between these two sets of 4 kind of critical success factors is quite tricky. But once you see that, then the KPIs, I think, flow relatively easily. Second one, an evaluation of the value of money service provided. Then he requires an evaluation using the data given in Appendix 1. So we have to use the data here. An evaluation, I should say. What did the previous one say? It said write a report. I think it's all right. Yes, as soon as you see evaluation here, it means you're looking for pluses and minuses, pros and cons, goods and bads. If there are figures around, you want to use the figures, but you can do an evaluation without necessarily knowing numerical values. Okay, but you have to see both sides of the argument a little bit. And here we have to, I would imagine, calculate some values. And I suggested the 3 E's. The 3 E's is effectiveness. That's we have to decide what the purpose of the police force is, what sort of crimes, what sort of activities it should undertake. For example, it would be a potential decision that the police force says, well, I'm not going to go around schools to give lessons to children about how to avoid crime. That's the parents' job. Now, if that's what they decide, fair enough, and therefore that will not come into any sort of value for money evaluation. But if they say part of our job is to prevent crime by involving and engaging with potential criminals before they start off in a big way, then that would have to be part of the value for money exercise. Then, having decided what you should and shouldn't do, there is efficiency. So let's say effectiveness will obviously encompass solving burglaries. Effectiveness may also involve finding motorists for speeding offences. So obviously with efficiency we're looking at the maybe the time taken to solve a burglary. We'll be looking at how much it costs to detect a speeding motorist, and for example obviously technology, speed traps and cameras and so on, is a lot to automating that can affect the efficiency. And then there is the economy. Having decided that you are going to install speed cameras and so on, let's put it out to competitive tender. Let's get the cheapest speed camera you can that does what you require. Okay, I'm not saying get the cheapest possible one that may not work. So I would start by saying that's really what you want to get in here for value for money. We can't say very much more about effectiveness. That's really a policy decision which we have here. But we could talk about efficiency. We could be doing things like the ratio of police officers to administrative staff. We could argue that maybe we should have fewer admin staff and have more police officers, because they're going to be the ones who are at the sharp end of detecting crime. It could be, we have here the number of crimes solved in a year. Well, let's take the number of crimes solved in a year, maybe divided by the number of police officers who are needed to do that. There's response to an incident within the allocated time. That's potentially to do with efficiency. If it takes you 2 days to visit someone who's been burgled, I can't really imagine that's terribly efficient. And then we have costs in here. We can be getting down here, cost of the police force, staff costs, all in there. We can be looking at the average cost per police personnel and so on. That could be something that we could shift on to the economy part there as well. So there were 13 marks. It shouldn't be too bad to get that, and we've got 3 years, so we could be calculating whatever metrics we decide to calculate it for the 3 years, and see whether they seem to be getting better or getting worse. That's where your evaluation is coming in. It's maybe that the clear up of crime is improving, but the cost per crime, if you like, is decreasing. That's good, but good on both fronts. It could be that the clear up rate is improving, but that rather more than that, the number of police officers is increasing. And of course there's a play-off there. So there's lots to potentially discuss in that. And then we have 3, the use of non-performance financial indicators. CEO wants to help her change focus towards using non-financial performance indicators, so to understand why financial indicators are not particularly useful for public sector organizations. The CEO wants you to explain this in your report and to illustrate your explanation by examples. So we said here, the only revenue the police force is going to be getting is from essentially government forces. Profit is nothing really to do with this organization. But you would be looking here, for example, we have got a number of complaints. So the number of complaints against the police goes up. If it goes up kind of out of proportion with other statistics, then it's very important that we keep an eye on that. Again, we're nearly being thrown back to two a little bit here. We could say that it's the rate of solving crime is a non-financial performance indicator, but nevertheless, there's public money going into a service. We need to have some handle, if you like, on what the public, the taxpayer, is getting for that. There's only 7 marks going for that. So a simple explanation, maybe 3 marks, as to why financial performance indicators were going to be very, very limited. Not completely limited, of course, because the cost per crime is essentially a financial indicator, but it's the return you get for the costs which are much harder to estimate. And we could say, of course, that measuring the service, measuring the level of service is difficult. First of all, deciding what we're going to measure, and then deciding how we're going to measure it. And then the last part here, the use of league tables in measuring the performance of Dealand police. Wants an assessment of the use of international police force performance, league table, and it's linked to targets for Dealand police. The CEO is especially concerned about police officers' reaction to this new idea as you have a powerful union which has widespread public support. Therefore, he also needs you to explain how the use of league tables and targets might affect a police officer's behaviour. So we have got, in a way, the old behavioural aspects of budgeting here. Things like, if you set certain things that are going to be measured, that's what people are going to concentrate on, and all the other stuff kind of goes into the background. It can distort behaviour. The old saying, what gets measured gets done. People can manipulate the figures. People can pick off easy targets. So if you're looking at the number of crimes solved, it might be relatively easy to solve, let's say, 20 small crimes, and difficult to solve, let's say, the one murder, the one very serious murder. And your statistics are, if you're not careful, going to be made to look much better if you solve the 20 relatively trivial crimes and don't bother too much with the murder, which you know might be very difficult to solve anyway. So there are all sorts of well-known kind of potential distortions and effects which come in for any sort of establishment of performance measures or budgets and so on, whether or not it's a league table or not. Now this question, when I read it, it reminded me of a question, as I said earlier, that it came up before in December 2013, and it was to do with a police service, and it was to do with league tables. And a couple of the things that, a number of things which, well, you could nearly write that old answer to write this one. So the sort of problems that come up with league tables is you are converting many measures into one score. Okay, a position essentially in a league. And the first thing you have to worry about is what aspects of performance are we going to bring in to this single measure, and how are we going to weight them? So are we going to give kind of 1 point for every murder scored, and also kind of 1 point for every speeding offence? Or are we going to weight them in some way? Are we going to leave out speeding offences entirely because they are in some countries not regarded as being maybe sufficiently serious to actually be in crime figures, although they are, it's illegal activity? Next, this is international. So what happens if you have different activities, or activities which are regarded as a crime in one country and not a crime in another? How comparable is this international league table going to be? So, for example, in the UK, over the last 5 to 10 years, the government brought in legislation dealing with what it calls hate crime. This is where you either abuse, or a crime has been partially motivated by hatred of somebody, or alleged hatred of somebody, because of their religion, their colour, their sex, their sexual orientation, or whatever. And in the UK, a hate crime exists if the person who's subject to the alleged crime feels they have been subject to it. So it is criticised because there's a considerable element of subjectivity. Hate, you are hated if you think you are hated, basically, without there being anything more objective. Now this has increased the number of crimes which are reported, because everyone, many people perceive, and in many cases there'll be very nasty incidents, but it's been brought, if you like, to the fore a little bit more, a whole, in a way, new category of criminal activity. And of course this has increased the number of reported crimes. Even if you hadn't got that change in the law, the police from time to time have advertising campaigns encouraging people to report crimes. So if you're assaulted, don't just go away and put ice on your bruise or whatever. We want you to report crimes, and when that happens again, you can find in some circumstances the number of crimes apparently goes up, but it might be the number of reported crimes. And all I'm saying is this will be different in different countries, so it's going to be quite difficult to know that we're doing fair comparisons. And the third thing I would say about league tables is that they're reducing lots and lots of detailed information down into one figure, your position in the league. And you could, let's say there were 5 countries in the comparison league. So number 1, the best performance, and number 5, the worst performance. Number 1 could have a score of 85, then go 85, 84, 83, 82, 81. The 5th one could be only 4 points below. And probably the 4 points are almost a measurement error. Yet suddenly from being clustered in the high 80s, one is now seen as being the worst. And of course that's going to be terribly embarrassing for people. And they'll do anything really, and no, they'll do anything not to be the last, but also it maybe is overcritical of the poor performance and over praising the ones at the top of the league. And finally, I would say on this international one here, there's going to be an element of national pride. Are foreign, or is any police force going to be reporting fairly on this? Is there going to be pressure either from the head of the police or the government department responsible to massage the figures slightly so that your country doesn't look worse than hitting the headlines and newspapers and all that kind of stuff? So there are quite a few potential areas there, and of course, if you want to be best, then you will put your effort in elements of performance which most easily get you a high score, and you will tend to ignore the elements of performance which have very little to do with your score. So let's look at what it said. I won't go through the ACCA answer for this question, but I will go through parts of really all of the ACCA answer for the 2013 one here, because sometimes when we do our lectures on APM, you see at the end suggested questions. Many of these are old, which have dropped off the ACCA website, but you can nearly always find it by Googling something like December 2013 P5 Estland or something like that, in this case the name of the question. And just because they're old questions doesn't mean they are bad or irrelevant questions at all. So 2013 said, discuss the merits of league tables in performance management and address the CEO's concerns over the use and managing performance in Estland. That was the name of the company there, not Deland, police forces. So let's see what the answer said. I'll just read through it slowly. The use of league tables effectively benchmarks performance and can have a positive effect on behaviour. Interesting. Look, I think they probably want you to... They want a report here. Anyway, sorry. I just going back to see if it said evaluate here, and I don't think it does. Let me just see if they put the evaluation tables here, evaluation here. He wants an assessment of the use of international police performance league tables. An assessment. Assessment is not far from evaluation, really. So I think assessment, again, probably pluses and minuses within it. Okay. So the use of league tables effectively benchmarks performance and can have a positive effect on behaviour. That's a good bit. The sharing of data and performance can indicate areas of best practice. So somebody's doing, in other words, somebody's doing really well. Let's see why they're doing really well. Could we copy that? And so improve performance across all forces. Additionally, the use of league tables gives a single figure which gives a clear, immediate answer to questions of performance. However, so now we get the bad side of it, if you like, or the potentially bad side of it. However, the use of league tables only measures relative performance. The best force on the table could still be producing an unacceptable performance in absolute terms. Very true. In order to avoid the problem, tables will often try to include comparable bodies from outside the area of control of the government. So here we have a situation where well, they're doing that anyway, shall we say. This may not be completely relevant to the question you're doing at the moment. However, to get comparable data in order to calculate an FS score for a foreign force would be difficult, as I said. On introduction, if the police force do not feel that they can affect the system, they will not be held accountable to it. They may ignore it or actively undermine it in public throughout their union. This could present the government with difficulty, as the police are considered experts in this area and their criticism will carry weight. Once the system is in use, the force score can be used as a target for leaders of each force. However, it can lead to over-focusing by employees on the variables of the force score to the exclusion of other relevant issues, in other words, only doing what gets measured. This means that they must encompass the key variables which drive desired performance, and in an international situation that can be difficult. The police staff may be demotivated by league tables if they feel the force score does not reflect valuable work, which is maybe not being counted in the league table, and they're driven by factors outside their control. For example, there may be a link between the number of crimes reported and the economic conditions of the areas. So in other words, your position in a league table could go up and down simply as the economy gets richer, gets poorer. The force score is complex. It tries to encompass a number of different outputs. This will lead to greater debate about the value of the measure for the reasons given above, and possibly reduced effectiveness. So as I say, you could almost have lifted that answer and put it in here. The police force, it was league tables. It's come up again after about 7 years. So don't ignore the old questions.